start off by introducing yourself and telling us a bit about your books, Bryan?
Yes, good evening. Hello, everybody, and thank you for your interest. I'm Bryan Lawson. I'm responsible for a group of books called the Drake and Heppel Mysteries. This is the first one. It's called A Degree of Death. I can never get my head around the way the camera works. There are now three books published in the series, and the fourth one should be coming out very, very soon. I use independent publishing. What you'll find is that these books have a kind of fiction in them in which not only the characters are important, but the time and the place is important too. So all of the books are written about real places. I like to describe real places I know and real places that are interesting. So the stories take place in real locations. In fact, I've been thinking about putting up a file of pictures of all these locations on the internet for people who would like to look at that when they're reading. But that's a little idea in my head at the moment. I'll try and get round to it after Christmas. So these places, the books all originate in the city of Chester. I was born in Chester. I spent quite a good period of my life in Oxford, but somebody had already bagged Oxford for crime mysteries, so I thought I'd try Chester. It's quite an interesting city. It's very historic, of course, and got a lot of really interesting places for where things can happen. You've got a river and bridges and the old buildings going around the city centre. With these extraordinary things called rows. Have you heard about the Chester Rows? They are two-level medieval walkways undercover. So it's like a medieval shopping mall, really. The whole of the centre of Chester is like that. So it's an interesting city to set fiction in, and particularly interesting for crime fiction. But in most cases, the book also goes out to another place overseas. I've been very fortunate in my life. I've been able to travel a great deal for my work. In fact, I was looking at it this morning and realizing I've worked in every continent except Antarctica. I don't know what I've done wrong there. They presumably don't want me down in Antarctica for some reason. But I've been able to go to lots of interesting places, and I know these places very well. So quite often I will take the story in some way out to one of these places. They're all interesting cities. But what I like to do is to make the events in the book happen, often as a result of things that might have happened in the past history of this place. So when you read the book, you're reading a story that could only have happened in that place or about that place. It could really only have happened at that time. So it's not historical fiction by any means, but things that happened in history have a bearing on the way the story goes, on how the characters behave and what they think of each other, how they relate to each other and so on. Excuse me. So that's the idea behind the novels. I try to weave all these ideas together into a tale that hopefully is interesting and fascinates you by the way it moves between various aspects of the story.
So when I read A Degree of Death, that goes to Singapore, doesn't it? And has a really interesting aspect of history and things I knew nothing about before I read your novel. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. That's the first one, A Degree of Death. I don't want to give too much away, but the idea here is that a member of the Singapore Parliament, a very distinguished man, is invited to come to Chester to receive an honorary degree. Now, this is a new fictional university, and like many modern universities, it's trying to make history about itself. And it has a business school, and they wanted to make this politician from Singapore an honorary graduate of the school so that he would help things in the business school. Unfortunately, he gets murdered in a very, very public place. In fact, this picture has a bridge in the middle of it, which is over the Dee in Chester, and our poor victim gets murdered right in the middle of this bridge. Now, the questions then arrive for Drake. Why was he murdered at the particular time he was murdered, in the particular place he was murdered, and in the particular manner in which he was murdered? And to understand some of that, he has to go off to Singapore. He realizes that some of the history of this man's life might be relevant. And so he explores Singapore in trying to find out more about his victim and what may have caused this crime to be done. Singapore is an absolutely fascinating place. It's a place I love very much. In fact, this year, 2020, is the only year for about 40 years I've not been to Singapore for obvious reasons. It's a wonderful place in itself. It's full of history, but it's also a very modern city. And so you've got these two things juggling together to start with. And it's a very good place to hop off to from Singapore. You can go to Bali, or you can go on to Australia, or you can go around Indonesia. It's a very good stopping off point. So I hope that when you read these books, and it's very nice to hear what you said just now, I hope when you read these books, you do actually learn something about the places that we go to. So I suppose the book is, in a very, very minor kind of way, a bit of a travelogue as well as being a crime mystery. I also hope there's a little bit of humour sprinkled around here and there in it. People are always funny, in my opinion. So that's basically the idea behind this book, Degree of Death. The next book, Without Trace, in that book, the United Kingdom, the Great Britain Minister of the Arts, disappears at the interval at an opera in Covent Garden. And the question is, where's he gone? Who's taken him? How do we get him back? And Drake and Heppel are called in to solve that problem. And that problem takes them overseas, not least to Sydney Opera House. So yet again, the book takes you around somewhere because of the way this crime was committed and linked to people in other places. Then the third book in the series, Fatal Practice. In this case, a famous architect disappears and is then found murdered in a very peculiar way that it takes half the book to find out, or at least half the book to find out how he was actually killed. I really enjoyed doing all the research for that. It's a very cunning way of killing someone. I'll say no more. But he was doing work in foreign places, and Drake suspects that something to do with the work that was being done in these foreign places has a bearing on the crime. And he goes off to a wonderful place called Penang, which I have had the great privilege to visit every year for years and years and have a bit of a holiday there. In fact, there's a little place in Penang that we stay at that has great big umbrellas in the garden made out of banana leaves. And I sit under one of those and write my books. So the books actually get written in Penang. A little bit of them every year gets written in Penang. The final book that's of the four, the one I'm currently working on, that's a totally different proposition. Probably best not to say too much about it, except it happens in the world of music. And again, there's some need to go overseas to resolve some of the problems. So that's the way I write crime novels.
You've created interesting characters in Drake and Heppel. Can you tell the readers or people who are sort of new discovering you a little bit about them?
I can say that I hope Drake is an interesting character, and I've been able to develop him as the books go on. I hope he gets more interesting. But he's not a detective who's a drunkard. He doesn't have serious illness. He doesn't have all these problems that sometimes detectives have. But he was married to a very famous and successful architect. And very sadly, she died a little while before the first book was written. And he was very busy in his career, and she was very busy in her career. And now that she's died, he feels some sense of guilt that he didn't spend more time with her. And in particular, that he doesn't understand as much about the architecture that she created as he would like to. And so it also happens that when he goes overseas, part of that comes into play. You can imagine that, for instance, if she did some work on an opera house, famous opera house, that would be a relevant part of the story. So he's not only trying to solve the crime, but he's also trying to sort out his own ideas about his wife and his own life and where it's going and what he wants to do with it. He's getting fairly near retirement, and he begins to think, does he really want to go on doing this, or would he like to change to learning more about architecture? So as you go through these books, I hope you'll get introduced to some aspects of architecture that you also find interesting. And the cities I go to are all full of very interesting architecture. I was actually watching a couple of nights ago, Caroline, there was a chat with John Mayhew. And I happened to think as I was watching that he and I must be at absolute opposite ends of this business. We both do the same thing, and yet we come about it in totally different ways. I don't write to make a living. I'm lucky enough to have my living. I write mostly, I suppose, to entertain people who I think might be entertained by things I like as well. And obviously I want to sell as many books as possible, but not for financial reasons, because what's the point of writing if people don't read what you've written? So maybe I might just tell you a little bit about my background, and that might explain a few things. Well,
yeah, please do.
When I was a very small boy, we lived in Chester. And for some reason that I really don't know why, and it always used to amuse my father, after I stopped wanting to be an engine driver, I wanted to be an architect. And actually, I've never stopped wanting to be an engine driver. I still drive engines. That's another story. And I grew up wanting to be an architect for some reason. And I went to the School of Architecture at Oxford and studied architecture there. But perhaps before we come on to that, I might go back to Chester, because there was a very funny planning policy in Chester in those days. The town planners thought it was appropriate to make new buildings look as if they were old buildings, which I thought was a particularly silly thing to do, really. New buildings should look like new buildings, and old buildings should look like old buildings. And so as a small boy, I used to stand in the middle of Chester, amused by the fact that American tourists were taking photographs of brand new buildings that they thought were historic buildings, because these looked the best ones. So they were only taking photographs of the new ones instead of the old ones. They wanted to take pictures of the best buildings. And my father used to tell this story about me going up to these Americans and telling them they were photographing a building that was about 4 years old. I must have been a terrible child. Anyway, I went to Oxford and studied architecture. And quite soon during the course, I began to think architecture wasn't quite the thing my tutors thought it was. My tutors thought it was an art form, and in some ways it is, there's no doubt about that. But I thought it was very much about people. There's nothing more fundamental than the buildings we live in and that we work in. They have an enormous role to play in our lives. And so I went and studied psychology after I'd finished architecture at Oxford, and started to learn about this business of the interaction between us and our environment. And that led me on to a lot of research about hospitals, actually. We now know through a lot of research how to design hospitals to make people feel better. Most hospitals do the exact opposite. They make people feel worse. The doctors are trying to make people better, but the place seems to be trying very hard to make them feel worse. And amazingly, you might be surprised to hear this, but amazingly, if we designed a new hospital with all the things that I know about it in it, the hospital would pay for itself. That's how much we can save in terms of the time people have to spend in hospital. First man to discover that was looking at a ward. I suppose you'd call it a women's ward in various ways, gynecological problems and people having difficulties with childbirth. And he found that the women who had a room with a window that had a view of trees out of it were released from hospital a day and a half earlier than the women who had a room looking at the other side of the building. And once we knew this, we started to do lots of research of that kind. And so there's now about 5,000 pieces of research worldwide that if we follow them all, then we can make hospitals that actually make people feel better. And I spent quite a lot of my life working on that. And one of the books I wrote about that was a book here called, it's called The Language of Space. And it's about the way we use space to communicate with each other, and how we arrange ourselves in space, how we take possession of space, how we claim space to be ours, display it to other people, and so on. And so I started writing a long, long time ago. I've never not been writing a book. I've written about a dozen books about that, and about this one called How Designers Think, which I wrote in 1980. It's in its fourth edition now, which is about the creative mind. How is it people are creative, and how do they make things like buildings, and how do they do art? And I found it fascinating starting to write creatively as opposed to writing more academically, that many of the things we learnt about how architects think also apply to how authors think, I feel anyway. I suppose you've now interviewed and discussed with so many people, you've seen many different ways in which authors go about their work. Maybe there are as many different ways of writing a book as there are authors, perhaps you might think. But certainly there are tensions between, do you map the whole thing out to start with? Do you know where you're going all the time? Or do you get into the book and change things? I'm in the latter part. I find I map the thing out in a very general way, but I find when I get into writing that my characters speak to me. Sounds a bit pretentious perhaps, but they really do. As I write their dialogue, I hear them saying things that I hadn't expected them to say when I was mapping it out in a very general way. And that changes the action that follows on quite often, and changes the way a character develops in the book. And there's a very famous psychologist, a man called Donald Shon, who said that creative people have a conversation with their work. And I think that's very true. In design, you do a drawing, and as you draw things, you see new possibilities. And I think when you're writing books like crime fiction novels, as you write it out and as you get prose in front of you on the screen, you react to it and see new possibilities. Even sometimes you see things that now you should have done earlier on, because now something else is going to happen. So the writing process is a very conversational process, I think, for me. I have a very rough idea where I'm going to go, but I do learn an awful lot from the characters in the book as I go along. Do you find other people have said something similar, Karen?
No, we do have a lot of authors who have a similar way of writing. I've got a few questions on the stream for you. Tony Millington wonders if any of your academic work crosses over into your crime writing.
Very interesting question. Interesting for me anyway. Well, it has a crossover in terms of the subject matter. So when I wrote Language of Space, I wasn't expecting later on to write fiction about people in space, but that's precisely what I do now. And so a lot of my understanding of how characters will behave in a place at a time with other people around them does come from my academic work of studying people in places. But the other side to the question, I guess, that's implied is there a payoff between academic writing and fiction writing? And I think the answer is no, not very much. In particular, with crime writing, it couldn't be more different, really. When I wrote this book, I was writing to explain. When I wrote this book, I was writing to mystify. So it's almost a totally different process. And I've had to learn it in a very, very, at times, painful way. I wrote a whole novel while I was still writing academic books to see if I could do it. It's one I threw away after, because I realized how much I had to learn about writing fiction. But there are some, perhaps, things that maybe people don't occur to people if you haven't written a crime book. Your job is to mystify the reader all the way through, not just about the main crime. The idea is to create an atmosphere of wondering why things are happening and what they mean and how things are going to develop. So, well, that means that you write things in a different way. Let me go back to telling you about my character Drake. I told you a few minutes ago that Drake's wife had died. In the first book, you know that he's very sad, and he's come back after a period of leave. What you don't know is that he was caring for his wife dying of cancer. You only discover that later in the book. So even something like that, which is about the character, I try to make things happen before I explain them. Whereas when you're writing academic books, you're doing your best to do it the other way around. You're trying to explain something and then give an example of it or move on from that. So I think it's an interesting question. I suppose I learned how to put sentences together and put punctuation in and things like that. But as a general writing process, no, it isn't very similar at all, I don't think, anyway. And I enjoy it far more. I enjoy writing crime fiction now much more than I enjoy writing academic fiction. I should just say that most of my books, I use in this term academic fiction, most of my books are written either for students or for the general public, as well as for researchers. And that's in itself quite a problem, trying to write for quite different audiences at once. Whereas when you're writing crime fiction, you think you know something about the audience. We were talking the other day in one of the groups. I don't know whether you saw the conversation. And I said in one of those conversations that I think there's an unwritten contract between, if you like, between me and you, between author and reader. And I think that that unwritten contract says it's my job to make sure that all the information you might need to solve the crime is there somewhere or other in the book. And I think that when you get to the end and there's the denouement at the end and the explanation, people have got a right to be upset if they find new information is now added, which they didn't know during the book, which really solves the crime. And I think that means the contract was broken. I've been misleading you to believe you could work it out as you went along. And so I try to write books where you can work it out as you go along, but I also try to make sure you don't. Though somebody asked me another question the other day, do you mind if the reader has worked it out? And my answer is no, not at all. As long as they still needed to read to the end to be sure. If it was so obvious that they don't want to read anymore, then that would be a failing. But I think if you've worked it out, did you work out what was going to happen in, I'm holding the wrong one up, in A Degree of Death when you read it? Do you remember?
No, but I never work it out. Your plot has to be very obvious if I figure it out. I'm terrible. I think the amount of crime books I read, I would get really good at solving the mysteries, but
I suppose it's
never.
a different skill, isn't it? you're trying to get into my mind as much as work out the crime. I think it's fascinating, this process of putting together a crime fiction novel with all these different angles and threads that you have to twist together. And that's what I really revel in. I really enjoy doing it. There are times when it's hugely frustrating and annoying because you can't get it all to work. But then you have this idea that will make it work, and then that's absolutely wonderful. And you write away like mad for a while, having perhaps not written very much previously. I was also struck when listening to John Mayhew the other night. He talked about his writing day. I don't have any such thing as a writing day. I write when I want to write, and I don't when I don't want to write. But most times I do want to write most days, but I don't try to have a pattern of a day in which I write so many words. Or I'd find that rather anti-creative for me. I think that you've got to do an awful lot of thinking as well as writing. And writing these kind of books takes an awful lot of thinking, an awful lot of research to make sure they are authentic, and they observe things about places or science in terms of forensics. And so there's a lot of thinking to do, and it's not just a matter of sitting at the keyboard and it will all come out. It won't. You have to do some quite hard work to get the stuff behind what goes in the book.
There were some nice comments on the stream. Tony said that his characters speak to him when he writes too.
Yeah, that's right. That's interesting, isn't it?
And even when he's not, sometimes.
Yeah.
Sam said she enjoys looking back to find red herrings, but like you, can't stand hidden information.
Yeah.
She also thought it was funny to think about you putting tourists straight when you were younger. And she says your books sound fascinating. Where's the best place to start?
Where's the best place to?
She said your books sound fascinating. Which one is the best one to start with?
Oh, I would start with the first one. I don't think it's the best one because I think I've got better. But this one is where the characters are first introduced, and they do develop as you go through the books. But I have written them all in such a way that they can be read by themselves in any order you want. But if you haven't got any reason to use a different order, then start with A Degree of Death, and then move on to Without Trace, and then to Fatal Practice. I haven't got a title for the book I'm writing at the moment, and I've nearly finished it, and it's worrying me because usually by this stage I've got a title, or at least some competing titles, and I just haven't at the moment. I've got some ideas about the front cover, but not the title.
Do you design the covers and things yourself?
Yes. And I made a real mess of the last one. It's very difficult, actually, because it's a remote process. You obviously develop all your own artwork, and then you go into the Amazon Kindle apps, which I use, and you have to work with them to a certain extent. But you don't immediately see back at you what it will look like. And often the contrast goes all wrong. So the last book has got very poor contrast in the cover, because when I would put the artwork in, it was fine. It's supposed to be, I don't know whether you're even going to see it here. You can just about make it out. It's a very twisted tree. In fact, it's a tree in Penang, and I spent hours photographing this tree. It plays a major role in the book, in the story. I can't explain why without telling you too much. But that's a bit frustrating. In all the other design work I've done, I've seen the result straight away. With this, I don't see it until it's almost too late. And I should have gone back and redesigned the cover, but I didn't. And maybe I will do one day.
Samantha has downloaded A Degree of Death.
Good.
While we're talking. And she says Drake and Heppel are great character names and quite different. How long did they take to come up with?
What, the names?
Yeah.
A long time, actually. In fact, I'd actually started writing A Degree of Death by using two little shortcuts for the two names, because I wasn't quite sure what the names were for a while. But one of the reasons for calling this man Drake is that it suggests something to do with history. And I wanted a monosyllabic name because I'm going to be writing it all the time. I didn't want a long name. And I've noticed that quite a lot of famous detectives have quite short names. But Grace Heppel is a very complicated person. She was actually, you will know this, she was actually a ballet dancer before she became a policewoman. And that sounds very unlikely, but I actually know somebody who did that. So it's partly modelled on her. And she had to come to terms with the fact that a career she thought was set out in front of her was no longer for her. And that's been a difficulty for her. But she's a very smart cookie, and one of these days, she will outdo Drake, and maybe he will retire and she will take over. She's certainly going that way.
I've got to admit, Grace was my favourite of the two.
Well, actually, what I use now, I used. Yes, I used letter A and letter B. The word letter A and letter B, until about halfway through the first book. And I think these names, it's a bit like having children. You agonize over the names you're going to give them, don't you? When it's when it's getting near the time that they'll be born. And I really agonized about these names. But other characters in the books, a lot of them often have foreign names. And I have to do a lot of research on that to make sure that the name actually works in the foreign language that they come from. For example, in the novel I'm writing at the moment, at one point the book goes to Prague, and Czech women feminize their names. So they put OVA at the end of the surname to say that they are the female of the species as opposed to the male of the species. Now, if you didn't know that, you'd make terrible mistakes throughout the book. So all my characters have to have, they're called something over if they're female. So you need to do a lot of research into names, I think. Sometimes the names just don't sound right. And when you hit the right sounding name, you know you've got it, I think.
Have you ever come across anything in your research for your novels that surprised you?
Oh, yes. I think one thing that surprised me a great deal recently is something very fundamental about Chinese culture. I know I've worked in a lot of Chinese cultures, Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and so on. And one of the things that's become apparent to me once you get right underneath the surface of it is that they don't distinguish much between history and now. They see history as still being alive, whereas we put history in a separate compartment from now. And we've a tendency to think we can't learn anything from history, or history doesn't have any value other than just being something you can read about. But for Chinese people, that's not true. The symbolism of their letters and their culture still works in their modern education in a way that's quite hard to explain this. But for example, a modern Chinese architect putting up a building is quite likely to use feng shui as part of the process. And that would seem very odd to us in our culture. We'd see feng shui as something that used to be used hundreds of years ago and wouldn't apply now. But the Chinese don't see that distinction at all. And I rather like them for it, actually. That was a great surprise to me. It taught me something I was surprised to know.
Samantha also asked, she says, you've lived in a few places. Do you have a favourite?
My favourite is the one I'm writing about at the moment, whenever that is, I think. So right now it's Prague. But Singapore and those countries, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia. I love those countries. I love the people. I love the cultures. So I will quite often be taking inspiration from that part of the world. I can tell you a little story that's just come into my mind, actually. You must realize from what I said earlier on that I traveled a great deal. Perhaps I should explain that I became Professor of Architecture at Sheffield University and eventually Dean of Architecture. And then I became visiting professor in a lot of overseas universities because they were interested in the kind of research I did and the way we taught. So I would quite often go abroad to work. And I had a wonderful taxi driver who was incredibly reliable. And he would pick me up in Sheffield and drive me to Manchester Airport. And when you're going on a long journey like the Far East, you don't want to be worrying about will you get to the airport on time. So this man was really quite important to me. And one day he picked me up in the car and set off driving to Manchester Airport. And he said, "Where are you off today, Prof?" He used to call me Prof. And I said, "Well, I'm going to America. I'm going to Boston. I'm going to MIT. "Oh, wonderful," he said. "That's very exciting, isn't it?" And I obviously really surprised him. I said, "No, I would far rather be going to the Far East than going to America. I've never found America anywhere near as fascinating as countries in the Far East. So my instinct is to turn to the East rather than to turn to the West." Excuse me, my throat's got... Sorry.
So we've got a lot of questions that have come up on the stream. I'm just going to see who's asked them. So Jason Kelly, one of our admins, he says, what authors have been an influence on your writing?
Well, I'm going to mention a couple of names that I don't see mentioned very much, if at all, in this book group. The first of these is a man called Barry Maitland. And he had an enormous impact on me. I managed to persuade him only recently to join the group, so he is a member here. Maybe he's even, I doubt if he's watching because he lives in Australia, so he should be in bed at the moment. But there's a curious thing about Barry Maitland and I. We were colleagues many years ago. We had offices next door to each other. And he was the first person I knew who gave up academia to write crime fiction. And he left Sheffield University and went to head up School of Architecture in Australia, but very quickly gave it up and started writing crime fiction. And I found his books absolutely marvelous. And the odd thing is that if you go to Australia and you say Barry Maitland's name, and you say you know Barry Maitland, you're treated as if you're a star because he's famous. But people don't know the name over here because his books are never published in this country. It's a very odd thing, in spite of the fact that his books, for many years, he wrote books about a crime-seeking couple who worked in London. So he had a great influence on me. And the other person I'm going to mention is someone called Christine Paulson. And Christine was also an academic. She was an art historian. And she was at last historian at Cambridge. And she started writing crime fiction. I don't know why I latch onto these ex-academics, but and she taught me quite a lot about crime fiction writing, has been very helpful to me. But I suppose I must, wasn't the question that was asked, but I must also give credit to two very good friends. And they were both ex special service in the Metropolitan Police. And they helped me enormously with the business end of writing the crime fiction. And they're wonderful because they do understand. Again, we see this discussed a little bit here, don't we, sometimes? They do understand that I'm writing fiction, and that the real crime, the real life of a crime fighter in, shall we say, the Met Police, most of the time is extremely boring. And if you wrote accurately about it, you would have hundreds of characters, because there are many people involved in trying to solve a crime like the ones we write about. And an awful lot of their work is extremely mundane, going through television records, going through old newspapers, going through all sorts of stuff to see if they can find something. So although they're very useful to me, these two, they're wonderful in terms of telling me about what really happens in the police, how they behave in relation to each other, and when they get cross with each other, or how things go in that kind of way. But the actual business of crime writing, I think, is very different from genuine policing most of the time. So I must give credit, thanks to them, because they've helped me enormously. And it's wonderful to be able to just speak to them and say, I'm doing this, this, and this. Does that make sense? And they'll say, yes, of course, it would be done this way, that way, and this way. But what you're doing, what you're saying, makes perfect sense to us in the context of a crime novel. And they read the novels too. So they're, as well as being advisors, they're actually readers.
Do you have any other experts that you talk to when researching? So anyone that you talk to for forensics advice, or?
Well, I'm very lucky in having a whole series of scientific colleagues back at the university who I could always ring up or email, and they tell me about things. But gosh, I was thinking the other day how much I love the authors of the classic period of crime writing, Agatha Christie, of course. But now modern forensic science would be interesting to know, wouldn't it, what Agatha Christie would write now with modern forensic science available to her. I'm sure she would have used it, but her books would turn out to be very different from the way they do now. And they look very dated now, don't they, because of that lack of forensics. So I do have friends who are doctors and who are scientists, and they help me quite often with, I'm able to use quite clever drugs as a result of being able to speak to these people, drugs that have particular effects, which I won't say any more about, but you'll find they, not in a degree of death, because that wasn't a drug death, but yes, I get fascinated by the forensic science behind it. And these days, there's an enormous amount on the internet, actually. I was quite surprised the other day. I went to see my doctor, and he was talking to me, and he started to tap away on his keyboard. And I asked him if he was using some special app from the health service. He said, no, he was just using Internet Explorer. So he looks at things on the internet as well as us. Obviously, they have to be sources that you can rely on, and that's the great danger of the internet, is finding information that's reliable as opposed to information that's a bit shaky. But once you know your way around, that's generally speaking okay. So I make enormous amount of use of the internet. And the other thing I use a lot, going back to my interest in places, I use the world application, where you can bring up anywhere in the world and walk along a road. And even though I know these places, I do that to remind me to make sure that I'm saying the right thing about a street and the building is really in this place in the street. That's a fantastic resource now. Fantastic resource. And sometimes I can actually find locations that way that I can use for perhaps minor things in the book that I need to do, but I didn't know about a good place wherever it is I'm writing about.
Sam says, how different is it to write about UK policing versus other countries?
Oh, that's a very interesting point. My Met Police officers, one of them worked a lot in Greece. When he went to work in Greece, he worked under the jurisdiction of the Greek laws and policing. And Mick, that's his name, Mick will always say to me, if I'm doing something overseas, your detective cannot actually do any investigation at all. He's completely outside the jurisdiction. And if you want him to do any investigation, he has to do it with the local police. And Mick says he couldn't imagine any country where they would allow a Met police officer to come along and start digging around. I think we've seen that very clearly, haven't we, recently about, I'm desperately trying to think of their name, the terribly unfortunate couple who lost their child from Leicester in Portugal. Can't think of their name.
The McCanns.
Yes. When our police go over there, they have to work under the jurisdiction of the Portuguese police. but jurisdictions are very, very different. Court proceedings are very, very different. And the degree of proof that's needed to convict someone, excuse me, that's different in every country. But although I do use overseas settings, the crimes are always resolved in the United Kingdom in the end. So it's a British crime, but it's partly relying on something overseas. Excuse me.
So I'm going to ask you one of our favourite questions from the group now, which is, what are your most memorable moments as an author?
Gosh, that's difficult, isn't it? I suppose the most memorable moment has to be the first time I saw a review of one of my crime fiction books. I'm going to say something that maybe sounds a bit churlish now. I got over the excitement of writing books a long time ago. I've been writing books all my life. So I don't find the process of a book going into print particularly exciting. It's just part of the process to me. I've seen it so many times that it doesn't excite me. But it's lovely to see somebody saying something about your book, even if it's not entirely kind. But you know that that person has sat down for many hours and read your book, and that's a wonderful feeling. There's a thing in Kindle Unlimited, you know, that the way that works is that we get shown the number of Kindle pages that somebody's read, and they use that to calculate the royalties that go to you, because the person hasn't bought the book, it's just on their unlimited capability. And if you're very lucky, occasionally you get one of your books is bought on Kindle Unlimited and nobody else is buying it at that time. And you can see how many pages this reader reads each day. And that's wonderfully exciting. They read maybe 50 pages the first day. And then the second day they read 200 pages. And you think, yes, I've got them. They wanted to carry on reading. And that's very exciting. So I think those are exciting moments.
And one of my other favourite questions to ask is, would you ever make a graphic novel version of one of your books?
Well, no, in the sense that I think you mean it, but I mentioned it earlier on. I have been thinking recently that it would be nice for all of my books, because they all use real locations, to put pictures of all those real locations in a file on the internet, which someone could find and browse on my website. And they could choose whether to look at them before, during reading, or after reading. I don't know how many people would find that worthwhile, but it's a thought I have.
I think a lot of people would like that. I like to visit places that I've read about and explore them and try and think about where things in the book took place. And there are like tours that you can do, aren't there, for different books and things. So I think it is a thing that people like, to be able to go and sort of visualize the places that you're talking about.
Well, and people also like books to be written about their own place. People in Chester get very excited about my books. There's a man that runs a website in Chester and has put me on there several times. And they think it's wonderful that I'm writing crime novels about Chester. And I understand that, actually. When you see a program on television that's about a city you know, there is a different pleasure that you get from it to exploring somewhere new. So, yes, I suppose I think probably I ought to do this. I ought to get these pictures together. What's been slightly putting me off it and tell me what you think about this. I'd be very interested to know what you think. Is I hate seeing a film about a film of a book I've read, because I didn't realize it, but while I was reading that book, I built the characters up in my mind. I built the places up in my mind. I knew where they were and how they looked and how they behaved and what they did. And then you go to the cinema and see the film, and it's nothing like that. And you get, yeah, really don't want to see all this. I'd rather stay with the version of it I had in my head. Do you have that feeling when you see a film of a novel you've read?
I think it depends. If it has a change that makes sense to be sort of televised or filmed, then I'm
Yeah.
okay with it.
Yes, I know what you mean.
If the characters aren't entirely how I pictured them, but they make sense in the context of the story, that works for me. So, like, the guy who plays Perez in the Shetland TV series isn't how I picture him, but he's a really good actor, and I can live with that in the TV show.
Yeah, so it's something different, isn't it?
Yeah. Whereas if it's like massively changed, or really doesn't fit with a very visual kind of description of the book, then I would have a problem with it.
Yes. I mean, I don't know what you think. I do describe places quite a lot because the places are important. And I think, therefore, people seeing pictures of them, that would be helpful. But if I put them in a separate file, they can choose whether to look at them or not. What I have found, contrary to what you just said, is particularly when it's an American film, because their whole cultural approach is different to ours, and they make a mess, for me, quite often, of the way the whole book was written. When you see an American film of it, it just, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But another man that I've relied on very heavily in my writing is a man called Edward T. Hall. And Edward T. Hall was a cultural anthropologist. And his job, can you believe, was to teach American diplomats how to behave abroad. And I think that's probably quite a challenge. So he worked a lot with the American embassies, helping Americans who'd never traveled before how to behave in the new culture they were moving into, so as not to upset or embarrass local people. And he realized after a while he was learning something, and he wrote a book called The Silent Language. And this book, The Silent Language, is all about his experience of trying to teach Americans about different cultures and how differently we do things. And it's a fascinating book, and it was really important to me in my crime fiction writing. The second book he wrote was called The Hidden Dimension, and that was a little bit like my Language of Space. It's about how people, excuse me, how people in different cultures behave in relation to space. Try and give you an example. Yes, I can think of one that would be helpful. As you go east, by and large, personal space diminishes. You first really seriously start to notice this in Istanbul. By the time you've got to the Far East, people will stand much closer to you, and they don't think that's rude. And in Arab culture, say you're going to wait for someone who's visiting you, and you're going to wait for them at a railway station. You don't do this very consciously, but you walk around looking for an obvious place to stand so they'll see you. Now, you don't expect somebody to come and stand right next to you. But in Arab countries, that might happen. That might happen because they're actually saying to you, well done, you found the right place. I agree with you. I'll stand next to you. Now, we'd think that was a bit weird if we were standing in the middle of a railway station in this country and somebody came and stood right next to us when there was lots of space around us. But it's a cultural difference about the way people use space. And you have to be aware of these cultural differences when you're writing fiction that's cited in different cultures. It's not so dramatic in Europe, although it is a little bit different. But as I say, once you get to Istanbul, that's the point where it really starts to change quite dramatically. And the way we use space and behave in space, and the way our characters have to behave, changes quite dramatically. I hope I get it right.
where East meets West, Istanbul, isn't it? I used to live there.
Did you?
Yeah, it's a fascinating place.
Isn't it just? Well, it's the bridge between Europe and the East, isn't it? It's the place where, in fact, you can cross the water, can't you? And on the west, you're in Europe, and on the east, you're in Asia, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I lived in Asia, and we used to go to Europe just for fun.
Right. But you can feel it, can't you, in Istanbul? You can feel the difference. And I think it's the first place where you really do. You feel it a bit in Greece and a little bit in Italy, but only when you're looking for it, I think. Istanbul becomes more apparent. By the time you've got to Singapore, it's very different. People use space very, very differently. There are some differences in Europe, and a very good example would be the difference between ourselves and Germans in terms of privacy. Germans have a much stronger sense of spatial privacy than we do. So in this country, for instance, if you were visiting somebody and their office door was ajar, you might tap on it and put your head around the corner and say hello. That would be terrible in Germany. You mustn't do that. That's an invasion of privacy. You must wait to be called into the room, or even to put your head around the door. And the other thing you mustn't do in Germany, compared with here, is to move furniture around. The Germans don't like you to move furniture around. So the Germans have no comparable saying for pull up a chair. You don't pull up chairs in Germany. You leave them where they are and sit on them. So there are differences culturally in Europe, but they're not as profound as in Africa or Asia.
It's been a fascinating interview. Do you think that the pandemic that we're experiencing at the moment will change people's sort of relationship with space and how they use it?
I'd like to think it does. The question is a two-stage one, isn't it? First of all, have we changed our behavior now? And the answer is yes, no question about it. One of my hobbies, I play the flute. And when we were doing all that business about clapping for the health service workers in the first lockdown, people came out all the way up and down our street, and I went out and played my flute. Would never have thought of doing that before. So we changed our behavior. The question is, will it last? I think some aspects of it will last, yes. And I think some aspects of the way we do business will last. I do think, for instance, my doctor is now using virtual consultations and realizing that he can save an awful lot of time doing that. And he might do that as a sort of way of triaging in the future. See somebody on the internet first and then decide whether they need to come in to the practice and be seen in person. And I think it's made people think, certainly made my doctor think. I think made people think maybe we could do things differently. I think I suspect, Caroline, being a northerner, and I'm not originally really a northerner, I'm from Chester, but people are much more inclined to speak to strangers in our part of the world than they are in the southeast. And I think maybe the differences might be more in the southeast because maybe people have started to speak to each other in public. Somebody was saying the other day, when I queue to get into the supermarket, we always talk to each other in the queue. We would never have done that before. So I'd like to think those kind of changes will last because we're more human with each other, and it's something rather nice about them. It's because we're all in it together, isn't it? That's the reason for it. For the first time in our lives, we're all sharing the same problem. We've never done that before. So it's a very profound thing, really, isn't it? As well as this business about space and distances. And the nearest I can think we've got to it is following a football club. If you follow a big football club, for my sins, I follow Sheffield Wednesday. And that's a terrible business because they're doing awfully. But if you saw another person with a Sheffield Wednesday shirt on, you would speak to them straight away, and they would speak to you because you share the same problems. But I found when I moved up from the southeast, people were much more inclined to speak to me as a stranger, which was lovely, moving into a place I live in a village outside Sheffield called Outybridge, and within a day or two of moving in, people were bringing us things to put in the garden, and that never happened to me in Berkshire. Nobody ever brought me anything to put in the garden. They thought I needed privacy, I think. But so cultures vary up and down our country as well, and I think this might have more effect on the southeast than it has on our part of the world. My son lives in Weybridge, and he's noticed it quite definitely, that people are speaking to each other much more than they used to. I hope that'll happen to you. Do you agree?
I hope so too. As an honorary northerner, I agree. It's lovely up here.
You're not from the north originally. I'm from Chester, but we don't tend to think of Chester as the real north. But yeah.
I'm from Lincolnshire originally.
Are you? Right. Okay. Well, yeah, but there is a difference, isn't there? There's definitely a difference when you, and I find it with driving as well. When I drive down to my son's in Surrey, I get to somewhere just about north of London, and the driving seems to get much more aggressive than it is up here. People let you in up here. People are trying not to let you in down there. It seems as if everybody's on the same side up here, whereas down there they seem to be competing with each other. Maybe that's a superficial analysis, but I think there's some truth in it.
So our time is up. Do you want to just give everyone a quick recap of your books before we finish off?
It's the Drake and Heppel mysteries. The first one is Degree of Death. There are two more out. They're all available on Amazon and of course on Kindle. The second is called Without Trace. The third is called Fatal Practice. And the fourth, which is going to come out very early in the new year, I haven't got the title on, and I do find getting the title is quite a hard part of writing a book. I don't feel the need to write so much in such a strong way as to indicate in the title that it's a crime fiction novel now, because there are several of those out. So I might relax that a little bit, and I've got one idea about the new book, but I need to think about it yet.
Fair enough. Well, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody watching. Happy Christmas.
Yeah, happy Christmas.